you again, and to have that lovely introduction from you then. So I note that we're now recording, which is great. I'm just going to fiddle about with some of the stuff here. So that, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, thanks very much. This is, I think, my third talk of the week, actually, and it's the first time I've done the graffiti one for a couple of weeks as well. So it's a nice opportunity to ramble on about historic graffiti for probably about, I don't know, probably about 55 minutes, something like that. I've slightly tailored this particular talk. It's one that I do quite frequently, but I've tailored it so that we can record it. As many of you know, and I know there's quite a lot of people in this meeting that I know either personally in real life or online, and a lot of people will know that I don't generally record my lectures, mainly because of sort of copyright issues. If you don't own the copyright, then you can't upload. But I've tailored this one so that it's pretty much 99% all of my own material, with one or two sort of Wikimedia Commons illustrations, so that we can actually have this as a recording for posterity for those who couldn't make it. So rarely, this is one of my talks which is going to be available afterwards. So thanks to everybody for coming. Once again, a really international audience, and thanks very much to Rob and to Hugh for asking me to speak for the Society for Church Archaeology. It's quite a thrill to be involved with this organisation. I do have a fairly lengthy history of mucking about in churches and cathedrals and monasteries, whether it be Rufford Abbey, Lincoln Cathedral, Southwark Cathedral, and numerous churches, too many to count really. So it is quite nice to sort of have that work recognised and to be asked to speak at this Christmas lecture. I don't really have a particular Christmas angle or theme, as I mentioned earlier, but there will be one moment towards the very end of the talk where we can definitely have a link in with Christmas, which was actually entirely unintentional as well. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you now. So there's going to be a short pause while I make this work. Just give me a moment. Oh, look, there's my email. You can all see my inbox there. So give me a moment. Swap and disable annotation. Okay, Hugh, can you just confirm that you can see the slides? Is that okay?
All clear.
Great, thanks very much. I really appreciate that.
Even though I'm called Rob Andrews on the
as I usually say this at the beginning of all of my talks, but as with all online lecturing, things can and do go wrong. Hopefully we won't have any internet outages today, but it can happen. I'm sure that if that does happen, Hugh will do some improvisation, maybe even a comic turn as the Lord of Misrule this evening. And speaking of misrule, I suppose graffiti is a topic which does have quite a naughty and transgressive reputation. But I want to show you tonight that graffiti in the historic moment was not necessarily something which was considered to be an eyesore or was considered to be something which was disagreeable in society. It was an opportunity for people who we would perhaps not ordinarily see in the historic record of documentary archives appearing in the archaeological world. And we are seeing the ideas, the emotions, the psychologies, and the hopes, fears, and desires of individuals expressed through graffiti on the walls. So it's a really interesting way of getting it literally into the heads of people, which is not something we can necessarily do using a lot of other subject matter. So I hope that you'll enjoy coming with me on this ride through the subject of historic graffiti this evening. I'll probably finish speaking somewhere around 8 o'clock, and we can go to questions. Please do put them into the chat, preferably preceded by 3 question marks so that you can spot them. There's a fairly lengthy introduction to this particular topic, and normally my introductions are quite short, but I've fleshed it out a little bit because it is quite an obscure, non-mainstream subject, or certainly it hasn't been mainstream. Maybe over the last 5 to 10 years it has become quite archaeologically mainstream, but I want to give you some context to the subject before we basically go into a big rundown of the types of graffiti that we might expect to find in parish churches, in monasteries, in cathedrals, but also in domestic secular buildings as well. So I'm going to give you the sort of the cliff notes on all of the different types. But it must be said that about 25 to 30% of all graffiti can be related to traditions of bringing good luck to a building, whilst also simultaneously warding off or averting bad luck, the fight of good against evil. And so we'll be looking at that in a fairly chunky section. And I'm going to give you a case study of my favorite sort of graffiti, actually, which is burn marks, taper burn marks, or candle burn marks, maybe rushlight burns on timber frame structures. And that's actually where we might have a little bit of a link into the Christmas season. I'll make some concluding remarks, as I say, just before 8 o'clock. So let's dive on in then. As Hugh sort of said, I'm a buildings archaeologist, and I run a very small one-man band outfit called Triskelly Heritage. We work with associates and collaborators as well, but in the main, it's me off out on site looking at historic buildings. I specifically work in the built environment. I don't really do digging anymore. I'm far too old and corrupt for that. So instead, I'm looking at standing structures, including, of course, lots of ecclesiastical buildings. Ironically, that's not a photograph of me in a church. That's actually a photograph of me in a windmill taken during the early part of the summer this year. But it does sort of give you an idea of what graffiti hunting might look like. And we'll actually come back to this image to talk about what I'm doing in just a moment. But I just want to sort of introduce the idea that the reason I've been asked to speak about this subject is that I do work in the historic built environment as a buildings archaeologist. So looking at structure in a very forensic manner to try and phase buildings, to understand the human agency behind why they look the way they do, how they've been remodeled, and when they've been remodeled, and for what purposes. A big part of that work that I do is, of course, outreach, because I believe that if you're going to be an archaeologist, then you really do have a duty of care to tell people what you've found. There's no point doing archaeology unless you do that. So as a result, do lots of lectures like this. We also do a fair amount of broadcasting too. So quite often to be found with a barrel of a lens pointed at my face and doing a bit of TV or radio, or latterly a lot of podcasts as well. And of course, lots of publications too, books, journal articles, but also a lot of online writing too. So I write quite a few blogs, including the Medieval Myth-Busting blog, which you must go and look at. There's lots of church stuff on there, including a new article on arrow stones in churches, where we supposedly have marks from archers in the 100 Years' War rubbing their arrows up and down to sharpen them before going off to fire at the butts. And I assess whether or not that's actually a genuine medieval experience, whether that's something that actually happened in churches. And you might be quite surprised at the result, because actually, no, there is no evidence for it, but it seems to be part of ritual medicinal practices. But it's a type of graffiti, of course, it's worth mentioning. Anyway, that's who I am and what I do. And I live just on the outskirts of Sneinton in Nottingham, which is where I'm speaking to you from this evening. And Sneinton is an inner city suburb. It used to be a little village, a little satellite village, but it's very much part of that inner city environment. Lots of brick buildings. It's quite deprived in many respects. It has an incredible diversity. It's a brilliant place to live. But the environment also comes with a lot of crime. And a sort of a low-level version of that is the graffiti. You can see this on a former railway bridge abutment, and you can see lots of graffiti tags. Now, for most people, this is quite transgressive. It's an eyesore. It's not desirable. It's perhaps redolent of drugs and ganglands and violence. And there is an argument which says that that is the case. I also would say that some of this is actually quite artistically proficient, and that if we were to study it, if we were to talk to the artists, if we were to try and understand what they're trying to communicate, that there is meaning that can be gained and gathered by studying modern transgressive urban graffiti. But we're not looking at the modern stuff today, but I just want to introduce this note of question that graffiti can actually be illuminative of the human condition. And of course, our most famous graffiti artist in a semi-formal fashion is, of course, Banksy. And he is Nottingham's own Banksy. This appeared at the height of the pandemic last year, at a time where Nottingham was getting a lot of really bad press in the local and national media for its COVID outbreak, but also for various scandals involving the city council, for Robin Hood Energy collapsing, the Broadmarsh development falling apart. We weren't having a good time in the press. And then Banksy bestowed Nottingham with this brilliant piece of artwork. And the town just sort of erupted in joy, and it hit the international media. And Banksy put this piece of art on the walls of a corner shop in an area called Radford, just on the edge of Lenton, again, an inner city suburb. And this used to be an area of very heavy industry, and all of these terrace streets are where the people who worked in those factories, cigarette factories, munitions factories, and also famously the Raleigh bicycle factory. This is where they all lived. Think Saturday night, Sunday morning, Arthur Seaton in the great Silito novel. This is his world. But of course, those factories are long gone. And I think what Banksy was doing with this piece of art is actually providing a satire or a burlesque, because we've got a young girl of what appears to be mixed race origins, and this is a very culturally diverse part of the city, who has stolen the inner tube or the tire from this bike. The bike is actually part of the installation. It's not just the transfer printed or the stenciled artwork. The bike is an integral part of it. And she's hula hooping with this tire. And I think it's a satire on the fact that the old industry has gone. This has become a very culturally diverse area in a way that it previously wasn't. But also Nottingham has this great reputation as a party town. So there's lots of students now living in this area. There's 2 universities, and also it's just a centre, a mecca for hen and stag do's as well. So I think this is the ideas that Banksy was playing on here with this piece of street art. But if we can come to understand the underlying meanings of modern graffiti art, can we start to look at the graffiti of a previous age, and can we start to interpret that? Well, I think we probably can. And this is an example of some graffiti from South Yorkshire, which I recorded, quite a long time ago now, probably 7-8 years ago, whilst working at Wentworth Castle, which is a 18th century mansion house, and in a former banqueting suite there, very dilapidated now, I found evidence that this particular building, the gun room, had been used by the local brass band. Now, I've done a bit of research to try and find out more about this group, and they were kind of a semi-formal brass band. So we don't really have much in the way of their minutes or their archives or photographs of them. There's just a few stray references to them on internet chat groups. But here we are, we're seeing a mid-20th century brass band in Yorkshire. And this, to the best of my knowledge, is the only archival asset that we have for this band. So this therefore becomes as important as anything you find in the local record office. We can start to unpick this. For example, we've got the names of the members of the band, we've got the instruments that they play, and we've also got their addresses. This is gold dust for a genealogist. There's also a bit more that we can learn as well, because there's a couple of names which have been excised from the records. So was there a scandal? How can we explain that? And what I also really like is that there is some genuine, proper Yorkshire humour going on here. So we find that the band leader is Mr. Trevor Jessup, brackets when nobody's present. And then we even see his instrument described as a gut wrencher. So there's a bit of commentary on Trev's musical abilities there. But you can see that there's a lot of information that can be unpacked from this particular image. And again, this is still 20th century, it's still modern, but if we can find these meanings in Banksy's work, in the Castle Ring Melody Men, can we look at genuine medieval and early modern graffiti, and can we understand something about the human condition? Well, hopefully over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to prove to you that we can unpick meaning from these interesting scrawls on the walls. many of which are, the vast majority, in fact, are pictorial in nature, because essentially we're dealing with a primarily non-literate society at that period in time, certainly until the middle years of the 17th century anyway. So a lot of this is pictograms. And if you can come to understand what those images mean, you can actually understand a lot about the society that created them. So we record graffiti using the raking light technique. Other options are available, but other options are notoriously expensive and create huge data storage issues. By mucking around with that torch, which only cost me £4 in a petrol garage, I don't actually use it anymore, it's broken now, but I used that for probably 5 or 6 years, something like that. We can cast light at a very sharp angle over the walls, and we can actually pick out graffiti inscriptions through the shadows that are cast. And often these are not visible to the naked eye. You need to create those shadows, and a kind of a 3D effect comes to the fore. And then we can capture that graffiti with a fixed position camera, insert a scale bar, take some notes, some important documentation to make sure that we know what we found, where it is, the photo number, that kind of thing. And then we can start to statistically model the graffiti in these buildings. So I'm working here at Kibworth Harcourt Windmill. We found something like 260 examples of graffiti there, of which nearly 18% was connected to this idea of bringing good luck to the building. So, you know, quite a low percentage. I mentioned earlier it's usually 25 to 30%, but bearing in mind that this building went up in 1773, you can still see that those old traditions, those old Apotropaic traditions, were still alive and well, albeit not in quite such high quantities as we find in the medieval or early modern period, but are still alive and well in rural Leicestershire in the later 18th century. And I'm sure you're all kind of thinking, well, how does he know how old some of this graffiti is? Well, in the example here, Daniel Hutchinson, the miller, left us a date on there, 1711. Now, this is the post of the post mill, which actually predates the hut or the book which goes around it. So it helped us actually, the graffiti here, to unpick the historical phasing of the structure. The post is older than the rest of the building. So graffiti was primarily important in understanding the development of that building. And we can use date in graffiti to start to understand what's going on. This is an illustration from Newark Castle showing some initials, presumably, and the date 1900. But what's important here is looking at the other graffiti around this dated example, because we can actually see these striations, which are man-made, which are sometimes thought to be these arrow sharpening marks by 100 Years' War soldiers. But of course, this is actually a graffiti that is within, or a graffito, which is within the bishop's private chambers at Newark Castle. So it would be unusual to find his archers sharpening their arrows there. But of course, what we're actually seeing here is that those striations, which are man-made, post-date the dated graffiti, indicating that they are probably 20th century. So they, in some senses, respect the pre-existence of the PR 1900. But one of them at the top there, this example here, actually cuts through the almost like cartouche surround to it as well, again indicating that this comes after this. So we can use relative dating, we can use the stratigraphy of the inscriptions. Okay, so this is still quite modern, but we can find older stuff. This rosette design, sometimes referred to as a daisy wheel or a hex foil, is genuinely medieval in date. And the reason that we know that is because there is the lime wash of the Reformation, which has dipped down into the inscription there. So this was originally cut on the walls of St. Mary's at Hairsborough, and then the Reformers came along in the later 16th century and whitewashed this over. And when the Victorians have then cleaned the church off to display the stonework, that lime wash has remained in places within that inscription. So here, this is a graffito that's on a piece of stone in the nave of St Mary's, which dates to the later 15th century. So we've got about a 100-year window between the late 15th and late 16th century when this potentially goes on the wall. So we're basically pretty much back into Catholic England. Now, you might have noticed that I've used some overdrawing techniques in the lecture so far. And it must be said that unfortunately they didn't have Photoshop in the medieval period. So as a result, I've overdrawn quite a lot of the graffiti for you, just to really draw attention to what I'm talking about. This comes into play primarily because a lot of graffiti begets other graffiti. So if you've got one piece of graffiti, you're going to find lots of stuff around it. And as a result, I'll want to draw your attention to just one illustration amongst the palimpsest of inscriptions. So that's why I've overdrawn many of them. You're just going to have to trust me that I've drawn what's actually there. So given the fact that we're talking about church archaeology tonight, we can probably see that a number of examples so far have come from churches here, from St James's at Southrepps in Norfolk. And I suppose that we should be looking for evidence of the liturgical practices of the medieval English church in action. And I suppose one of the more commonly found and also well-known types of graffiti would be these mass styles, which are usually, but not always, found on the south walls of parish churches, and quite often in close association with the porches, the south porch. Here's a lovely example from Holy Trinity Lamley, which is just up the road from me here in Nottinghamshire. And it is, of course, a primitive sundial. Now, the great specialist in medieval graffiti who literally wrote the book, Matthew Champion, has ruminated on these things and has postulated that they might actually be related to bell ringers who sort of need to know exactly the moment when to start ringing the bells to call the faithful to prayer in the church, and that's what these things may actually be. Sometimes they're found recited elsewhere, but it's just an interesting notion to consider the fact that we've got this group of people who are involved in, a semi-formal piece of graffiti. This is not quite illuminative of the psychology that we're going to see slightly later on, but it is reflective of church practices, the idea of calling the faithful to prayer. And of course, when you do come to these masses in the bigger churches, the town churches, the great cathedrals, the monasteries, these masses are going to be sung. And so here we have a lovely example of some notation from the walls of what was once St Albans Abbey, is now, of course, this great cathedral, which I would say without a doubt is the best graffiti building in this country. There isn't a square inch of the walls of this cathedral between about knee high and slightly over head high where there isn't lots and lots and lots of graffiti. Here you can see a couple of examples of musical notation, but also there's other stuff going on here. There's ritual stuff in there, there's lettering in there, there's architectural drawings, and you can see why I've had to overdraw at the moment. But this is actually a 15th century piece of notation, and I got a folk musician friend of mine called Mick Phillips to record this for me a few years ago, and it turned out that it was a variation of the folk song Boys and Girls Come Out to Play, which you can start to see now the importance of historic graffiti, because it does link in with all sorts of other histories. Musicologists were all over this, for example, or would be. So, this can be quite important in other fields as well. So if we're, again, considering the practices of ecclesiastical archaeology, and we're looking at graffiti in churches, we perhaps shouldn't be too surprised to see lots of crosses in these buildings. Surely they're devotional, maybe related to pilgrimage or prayer or religious thought and activity. But again, this is one of the things where the statistical modeling of the archaeology of such things comes really to the fore, because it's been found that about 80% of crosses are found in and around the area of the church porch, which is a very, very high distribution. And we might want to consider what the porches are used for, because they're not just these liminal spaces, taking one from the secular into the sacred world, if people even thought like that anyway, because there's a great intermingling of sacred and secular in all activities of medieval and early modern life. If we think about what goes on, they are used in some services. The baptismal service and the marriage service both have elements which are carried out in the church porches. But we also know from pretty good documentary evidence that this is the place where you come to do your business dealings. You make your contracts in the church porch, presumably because it's holy. It's a place where you can literally sign your contract, and these crosses are possibly the physical mementos of those contracts, that you've made a deal and then you've signed on the holy building. I suppose the equivalent of swearing on the Bible in a court of law, something like that. But again, it's the using the statistical modeling to understand the phenomena. But it's not all sort of high-minded stuff. Not everything that's going on in churches and the graffiti that we find on these buildings is related to this sort of liturgical or economic life of the parish. We also find really quite humorous graffiti as well. This is probably my favorite from St Albans. It's a cat, and those of you that are, as I am, owned by cats will understand fully what's going on here. This is a cat giving itself an intimate wash. That's my eldest cat, Spike, grooming himself 4 years ago in the garden of our old house. This is an observation of the real natural world around this environment of the great monastic church of St Albans. There's a strong chance, but not necessarily a guaranteed chance, that this is actually created by one of the monks. It could be a parochial visitor, but they've seen this. This is a scene of life which has tickled their fancy, and they thought, right, we're gonna make a representation of that. And cats in churches are, not a modern phenomena. Of course, many of the cathedrals still keep cats. Canterbury has something like 5 of them. Southwark famously had Dawkins Magnificat until fairly recently. Panga lives at Wells, for example. But at Exeter, they were keeping cats back in the medieval period. That's a medieval door there, which leads up from the north transept of the cathedral up to the mechanism of the famous cathedral clock, which runs on lots of ropes and pulleys. And presumably, at some point in the medieval or early modern period, there was a concern that the rats and mice who also lived in the cathedral were causing damage to those ropes and pulleys. So they've actually cut a primitive cat flap into that door so that the cathedral cat could actually run up the steps and catch the vermin. And of course, we even see representations of that vermin in the form of the Southwellminster rat on the north wall of the nave there. So observations of the world around, but also observations of the human condition as well. So I suppose it's worth pointing out that the way that people thought of themselves was perhaps not in terms of their name, but was more what they offered society. So if you're actually going to memorialize yourself in a church in the form, say, of a tombstone, a ledger stone, such as these from Newcastle, you leave behind a memento of what you did in the world. So here, along with these cross fleury, we see the swords of the soldier, or we see the shears of maybe the farmer or the tailor. This is what you did in the world, and you leave a memento of it. And so I think some of this graffiti that we're seeing also does that. So we've got maybe the woodsman's axe or the forester's bow on the walls here. Of course, this could be an archer, could be a soldier as well, but we're being told what these people did in life. And I suppose this could be the equivalent of Kev was here, Kilroy was here, etc. These could also be prayers in stone as well. I want to leave something behind, something physical, to remember this great prayer, which I've asked the saints to intercede in heaven on my behalf with. It's difficult to interpret some of these. I do say that. And I must say that much of the graffiti that you're seeing tonight has been sort of cherry picked as the best examples, or the stuff where we can be a bit more sure. But context is everything. We can never make one size fits all statements about historic graffiti. Just because you've got what's potentially the Forester's Bow here at Trunch doesn't mean that it's the same in another church as well. Context is all. Some of these could be Mason's marks, of course, but I don't think either of these are. They're not regular enough. Individuals also feature through the gang that they belong to. And I really do genuinely, I'm not saying this as a flippant thing, but I do genuinely think of medieval aristocratic families as like mafioso gangs. And they dole out these livery badges and symbols of their heraldry to their supporters, particularly in the late medieval period. And so when we find these great armorials, very detailed one here from Callum, surely we should be whooping and celebrating because we're going to find out what family this is. Well, unfortunately not. You can send this to the College of Arms all you want, and they'll come back to you with a rather glib statement of, well, what colour is it then? Because without the colour, I'm afraid you don't really get much help where heraldry is concerned. So unfortunately, the Callum example remains unknown as to what family or group of families are represented here. But strangely, the much more simple example from Tattershall, by looking at the context of it within the site of Tattershall Castle, we can actually understand how this comes to be here, because it's the ragged staff of the Earls of Warwick. And if you look at your history of the building, in 1453, in the month of August, the younger brother of Warwick the Kingmaker, a chap called Thomas Neville, got married to Ralph Lord Cromwell's niece. Cromwell is the great patron of Tattershall, and they got married in the castle chapel. So what we've potentially got here is one of Warwick's supporters, one of his liveried staff, actually carving the badge of the gang that he belongs to onto the castle staircase, presumably during some sort of great feasting. So we've got the gangs that people belong to, the jobs that they do in life, but we also have their faces and their appearances as well. These are two very late medieval examples. In fact, one straight into the early modern period. On the left-hand side, very small graffito, only an inch or two high and impossible to see with the naked eye, is the face of a late medieval man looking straight back out at you. It's an incredible thing. He's got shoulder length long hair, not too dissimilar to my own, and he's wearing one of those very characteristic caps that you see in portraits of people like Thomas Cromwell or Henry VII. This dates to around 1500, probably 25 or 30 years either side, judging by the style of the cap. And also we can use costume history to understand that on the fireplace of Home Pierpont Hall, another very small graffito of a lady wearing a great farthingale dress and a head tire, characteristic of the last decade of the 16th century, running up to about 1625, 1630. So again, useful for costume history. But it's not just their faces and the clothes that they're wearing, but it's also parts of the body. And hand graffiti is remarkably common. Again, this could be an aspect of Kilroy was here, or maybe a prayer in stone. This is probably quite a late one, though. This is actually a left hand with the initial IH and the date 1812 within it. It's on a post-medieval porch at Sibthorpe. So again, we need to take this in and of its context. There is some evidence that hand graffiti can be related to apotropaic practices for warding off evil as well, as are in fact shoe outlines as well, but they're not always, again, always to do with warding off bad luck or evil. And these examples from St Mary's at Warwick probably have nothing to do with that at all. These are quite late. They're on an 18th century lead roof, which was actually laid in the first decade of the 18th century. And we can again use our clothing history, because left and right shoes didn't really come in until the middle years of the 19th century. So that the group at the bottom right-hand corner there, where we don't really see clear left and right, they're probably somewhere between about 1710 and 1850, so we can date them. It's probably a family grouping. The bars between them are showing. What are definitely connected to family is the upper example, where we're seeing a left and a right shoe. The left shoe, WB and EB there, but the love heart as well. And the fact that the right shoe actually has more decorative details and a heel on it indicates that it's probably a woman. This is almost certainly a man and a wife who've gone up to the roof of St Mary's and left a memento of their love behind. A very touching memorial, really. There's over 100 shoe outlines on the roof of the Beauchamp Chapel at St Mary's, and they're all on the one pitch of the roof, and it's the pitch of the roof that overlooks Warwick Castle. So here we might imagine people going up there, maybe picnicking on the lead, looking out over the castle, which is framed by hills in the background, and enjoying a Sunday afternoon up on the leads when it was still accessible to the public. So some quite touching memorials. And we also see individuals in the later period where they actually tell us their names and dates, where we're starting to see literate graffiti creeping in. You don't really get it much before the middle years of the 16th century, so this is quite an early example. And here we see John Fairbank initially leaving his graffiti there in the top right in 1568, and even giving us his merchant's logo. This is his corporate logo. He's a merchant, and this is what that is. It's a merchant's mark. They're very common. And by noting this, which includes the J and the F, we also can then find John the previous year at Tattershall as well, 1567, and there is his merchant's logo again. Why might a merchant be leaving behind his logo? Again, Kilroy was here, a prayer in stone, something like that. But I think we can possibly say that merchants might actually have good cause for leaving behind graffiti in an ecclesiastical context, because they've got a lot riding in the world. There's a lot of money resting on their affairs. And I think we can possibly sense that in the form of ship graffiti. Now, again, not all ship graffiti is related to mercantile activity, but I think a lot of it is. Beautiful example of a late medieval ship there from Thornton Abbey Gatehouse, and a slightly later 16th century ocean-going galleon there from Norwich Cathedral. But the very simple boat that we see here at St Thomas Becket, I think, is the clue to what might be going on some of these graffiti examples, because the example from St Thomas Becket there, beautiful little church on the edge of Lewes, very small but stuffed with graffiti. We've already seen some examples of it in the form of that woodsman's axe earlier. The axe, I think, it's either on that pillar or that pillar, but I think it's this one here. The ship graffiti or the boat graffiti, there's 3 examples, and they're all on this pillar here, and they're all on 2 faces of it, which directly overlook this altar here. And I think what we're seeing is prayers in stone. This is merchants or sailors or the family of people who are out at sea praying for safe return, for good wealth to be incoming as a result of the deal that's going on. And I think we're actually seeing some of these ships which are related to votive activity. This is all very wholesome so far, isn't it? Sort of life in medieval and early modern England, but it does get a bit darker. So, for example, here's an example of a curse, a graffiti curse from Norwich. This is found in the chancel of Norwich Cathedral, which was, of course, once a monastery. If I interpret it for you, it's been drawn back to front and upside down. There it actually is. It's the name Caneford in the late medieval script, a fairly prosperous Norwich family. If you invert something, you take something which is good and you turn it to bad. So it becomes a curse ultimately. And the interesting thing here is it's found in the chancel, in the choir, the holiest place of Norwich Cathedral, which is only really accessible to monks. So we can see here some non-holy behavior. The Cainford family had clearly upset one of the monks of Norwich Cathedral, or Norwich Abbey as it was then, and the monk has responded by cursing them, by turning their name back to front and upside down. And this sort of dark aspect is there in quite a lot of graffiti. So here we can see representations of the end of life, execution at Tattershall and Gainsborough, both secular buildings, but buildings which were courts, although admittedly not courts which had the power of life and death, but scenes which were redolent of justice, scenes which would have been very familiar to people as a result of the gallows, which were abundant in the environment of this period in time. The gallows in Nottingham, for example, standing at the top of the Mansfield Road outside of the city, but something which was very, very familiar. And we see here gallows represented in the graffiti. And of course, that's so connected with the idea of death. And we do have memorials, mementos of those who were lost by presumably their families. They're usually names enclosed within church-like buildings with crosses on the top of them, here from Newark. This is presumably left behind by the family of John Glover, who could not afford an effigy or a ledger stone to memorialize him. And so they've taken their knife blades out and they've left a memento of his life behind. Again, very, very touching. But this idea of the darker side of life, life and death, does, as I say, come in very, very clearly in the medieval period, with about 25 to 30% of all graffiti relating to apotropaic practices, the warding away of evil or bad luck and the bringing of good luck. One of the ways this was done was through the carving of pentagrams. And the pentagram is very important in medieval England and in fact Europe. It's important because they're taking ancient Judaic traditions of the seal ring, which God had given to King Solomon, which had power to repel demons. This is then interpreted by the Muslims as a 6-pointed star, and when it arrives in Western Christianity, it's a 5-pointed star. And we find out from the late medieval poem Gawain and the Green Knight just how important this is. It's the symbol of Solomon. There's Christian numerology on the number 5, but also it's an endless line, which is seen to be very strong. It will not fail. It's an underpinning of a very important idea of protective behavior. The poet digresses at some length to tell us about Gawain having the pentagram on his shield and on his harness as he goes out into the wild to fight all sorts of strange beasts and the Green Knight, which is often he is thought to have been inspired by Lud's Church in Staffordshire, which is supposedly the chapel of the Green Knight. That poem having been written up on the moorlands in that region. And so we can actually see pentagrams on the walls of our buildings, which are there presumably to offer protection from the perception of the threat of evil spirits, of witches, and of demons. Now, we can see pentagrams sometimes as mason's marks, but this is not one. It's too carelessly drawn. If it's very carefully chisel cut, then yes, some of these symbols are definitely to do with stonemasons. But in this instance, I think we've got a protective pentagram at Azelby in Lincolnshire. And that idea of the endless line being protective is quite common. And it's not just the pentagram. It can also be seen in mesh patterns and checkerboards, such as these from St Albans. It can be seen in knotwork, sometimes called pelters or swastikas, in the form of these from Holy Trinity Tattershall. It's there even, they co-opt gaming boards. This, 9 men's Morris or a 3 men's Men's Morris or a Merrill's board is an endless line design. But this one is vertical and only about an inch or two in height. It's not a playable board. So again, because it's an endless line design, one that's very commonly represented because it is a gaming board, that is co-opted for protection as well. And we've already seen this example from Hairsborough in Norfolk, which is a rosette, a circular design, and circular so-called compass drawn designs are very, very common. They're probably not drawn with compasses there because they're quite a high status piece of apparatus. They may be drawn with shears or possibly just two nails pushed through a piece of wood. There's great debate about these non-endless line, potentially protective designs, the double V and the M's, thought to potentially be Marian marks. Are they the M for Maria and the VV, the Virgo Virginum, for Virgin of Virgins? Or are they simply initials? I stand somewhere probably in the middle of this. I think some are initials, some are Mason's marks, but some are undoubtedly Marian in quality. Mary, of course, being so popular in the Catholic medieval church. And I think that a lot of the illustrations that we've seen in graffiti, which are in a sense protective or asking for protection, are probably being inspired by formal church art itself. Mainstream church art uses many of these motifs, whether it be the letters A, M, and R underneath the crown of heaven for Ave Maria Regina, or whether it be the protective rosette above the gate portal at Ethelbert's Gate at Norwich, or the five-pointed star in the Great West Window at Exeter, which is also in association with lots of other Christian numerology within this Great West Window. I think that graffiti might be learning from some of this more mainstream stuff as well. These protective symbols, the rosette here, the daisy wheel, is often a stand-in for the cross in early tympanum. So why might people be really concerned about these threats to their souls? Well, as we move into the early modern period, there's a great change in society, which I'm sure many of you were very familiar with from your own readings. But the early modern period seems to be a real spike in graffiti connected to good luck and bad luck. And this is the period of the Reformation, but it's also a period where we see population doubling and putting greater strain on resources. At the same time, there's a change in agriculture so that people are losing their livelihoods. The manorial systems are breaking down as the manors are enclosed and people are turfed off the land. There's a genuine lack of food. And oh, look, there's a drop in wages too. It's a real nightmare, perfect storm. And what people tend to do is to actually start blaming one another for their perceived problems, and maybe not coming to the real socio-political, religious, economic problems, but actually James Sharp, the historian of this period, has pointed out that in pre-modern society, it's very common to start blaming these problems on the intervention of witches. And we see this being enshrined in law and banning it as a capital offence throughout the early modern periods. And actually, when you look at some of the accusations of these hundreds of thousands of legal cases across early modern Europe, we can actually see statistically that slightly richer members, stable members of the population, are more likely to be beating down and blaming people who are more liminal, marginalized, alien, and others. So teenage girls, spinsters, people who are more vulnerable in society, and they accuse them of witchcraft. So it's a real problem at the time. And one of the ways that this comes out, therefore, is that people are really genuinely terrified of witches, of demons, of evil spirits. So they start to mark up their buildings to protect themselves from this perceived threat of hellish minions loose in the land. And the final case study I want to give you tonight really is my favorite form of graffiti, the burn mark, which used to be interpreted as unattended candles accidentally scorching the timbers of our wooden buildings. And that never really stacked up for a lot of people. And John Dean and Nick Hill did some great research on this in vernacular architecture, where they, I think, pretty much conclusively proved that these marks are very, very difficult to make accidentally. And actually, the way that you create them, and you can see me following their experiments here in my study at home here, you can see that they you have to hold your taper, and it probably is a taper because candles are very, very expensive, at about, you know, a 45-degree angle or so, and you actually have to hold it there consistently for a fairly long period of time to actually get the depths of burns of some of these marks that we're finding on our historic buildings, up to 20 minutes in some cases. So we can see some examples here from the jamb of the portal of the rood screen at St Mary's Bunny, a late medieval rood screen there. So we're getting them in churches. They're also very, very common in secular domestic buildings as well, both high and low status buildings too. But there are a good smattering of these things to be found in churches where we do have surviving historic timber work. So we've got a deliberate human behavior pattern. And how might we explain this? Well, going back to Holy Trinity Tattershall, we can see that it's highly unlikely that these things are accidental burn marks. This is on the back of a door, not a place where one would expect to be mounting a candle, particularly in a building which has got lots and lots of venues for mounting candles, particularly in the medieval church, which values them as protective charms themselves. Lots of the masses have blessings of candles, which then become protective. The Candlemas ceremony deliberately blesses candles, and people would bring their own candles and tapers to the Candlemas procession. They would be blessed, and then they would take them home. But I think we are seeing these burn marks as being representative of that idea of the holy candle. And the reason we might be finding them on the backs of doors, but also in close association with windows and with fireplaces as well, is because from the writings of James VI of Scotland in his book, The Demonology, we do hear that there was a real, genuine piece of folklore which suggested that evil spirits passed into buildings wherever there was a draft. So your doors, your windows, your fireplaces, and these are seen to be those liminal spaces which are in some sense vulnerable to possession. So that might explain why we've got this burn mark on the back of the door at Holy Trinity, because it's there using one of these protective votive candles which has been blessed to give power over the devil. And this idea of demons loose in the world is very common. You can see it here from Merck's Festial, written in the 1380s, where we're told that demons are loose in the world and that they tend fires and they burn down houses. So are we seeing these burn marks as being a bit like inoculation? Burn your building a little bit and it won't go up in massive conflagration as a result of demonic behavior. But we're also told that as well as burning down houses, demons are loose in the world, and they're actually creating great storms which trash buildings as well. And I just wonder if there's an element of the demonic but also the protective in the famous story of the black dog, the black shuck, the devil appearing at Bungay and at Blythburgh in 1577, published by the Reverend Abraham Fleming, who tells us that there's a great storm, and then this hellish black dog appears and launches itself through the parish church at Bungay, killing 2 people, and that there's this great sort of reckoning takes place during this great storm, which is of course associated with demonic behavior. This is actually based on true events. The church warden's register and the parish burial register make it apparent that on that day in 1577 there was a great storm and 2 people were killed. They were probably struck by lightning whilst in the belfry. They're the bell ringers during the service, but there's just slightly, I wonder if there's a compelling notion that during the storm, they might have been in a belfry ringing the bells to create the clamour, which was also believed to drive away demons. Of course, this didn't actually happen. And then later on in the year, Fleming publishes his famous report where he actually ascribes these deaths to the black dog appearing, but there are no eyewitness accounts to that. Anyway, the devil, the black dog, goes from Bungay and he goes on his great rampage across the landscape, over to Blytheborough, where on the north porch door, one can apparently see the devil's claw marks as the devil is trying to rip his way through the church door. And again, here we hear that another couple of people are apparently killed and other people are blasted by this black dog. But I just wonder what is going on here, because these very famous burn marks are ascribed to be the devil's claws, but are we getting a very tangled memory here that these things are in effect related to the devil because they're there to protect against the devil? And in the telling of the story, it's become somewhat mythologized and tangled up a little bit, and they've become the result of the devil rather than protecting against the devil. But it's just a compelling thought here that this post-medieval tradition may have altered slightly in the telling. Anyway, if you're interested in burn marks, please do pop along to my own Christmas lecture in a couple of weeks' time. I'm doing a talk on burn marks and burn marks alone for the Triskelly Heritage winter lecture series. The Christmas lecture is going to be on burn marks on the 30th of December, and I'll be looking at this with relationship both to churches but also to secular buildings as well, and trying to unpick lots of the folklore and also the archaeological experimentation of how these things actually do work. But that brings the talk to a close for this evening. I'm going to hand back over to Hugh, who's going to wrangle your questions that I believe have been dropping into the chat as I've been speaking. But I'd just like to sort of conclude by saying that, using this raking light technique, we can really get to grips with graffiti. We can start to understand it. And it really does offer a completely unique resource to understand the lives of ordinary people in a way that those lives may never be represented in the historical archive at all. So anything we find on the walls is as important as anything you can find in the record offices. And most buildings have got them. I'm struggling to think of a building that doesn't have historic graffiti in structures that go up before about 1750 or thereabouts. And even later on, there's still lots of graffiti which can be unpicked, literate graffiti, that is. And, they really do help us to understand these psychologies and emotions. And it's not just sort of life and death, but a huge percentage of this is to do with people's fears. And this was a huge importance to people to try and protect themselves from the perceived threat of evil. So that's why we find so much of this stuff in our buildings. But by studying this archaeologically and by forensically surveying it and carefully recording it and then sort of mapping it and statistically modeling it, we can get to truths. And I think we can get just that bit closer to what it was like to live in the medieval and early modern period. So I'll leave it there. If people want to ask questions, please do bung them into the chat and we'll do our best to get through some of them. And if you don't want to ask a question in the chat, you prefer to contact me privately, please do. There's my contact details, James at Triskelly Heritage, or you can tweet me. I do quite like answering questions on Twitter. I quite like that sort of public outreach. And if I don't know the answer, I can always collar somebody else who possibly does. So I'm going to hand back over now. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we'll do our questions. So thanks for your attention to everyone who's been here tonight.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, James, for that. So I'm just getting my own screen back to normal as well. We've got quite a lot of questions, which means I don't have to grill you about Thornton Abbey. It's sort of a red flag to show some graffiti for Thornton, and I was going to ask you about the post-mill graffiti at Thornton. And we've got a very, very diverse range of questions. Sorry, the reason I'm slightly hesitating is I'm trying to get the chat box up, and I'm trying to resist the urge to put my glasses on, which I don't do in public.
You're very vain. You're very, very vain.
Extraordinarily vain. I don't normally have to admit it. So we'll start with a simple question while I get myself ready. We've had and I suspect this is going to be actually not a simple one and a very complex one, is what is the oldest piece of graffiti you have found?
Oh, me personally?
Well, yes.
Yeah. Dating graffiti is quite tricky. When I do my usual version of this talk, I usually give a case study of the King's Tower at Knowle, where which is a country house, where we've actually managed to not just give a broad period for the graffiti, such as the example from Hairsborough, it's within a century. But here we've been able to pin it down to the winter of 1605-6, because it was actually the graffiti was put there by carpenters during construction, and we know the date of this particular beam because we've had it dendro dated, and also we have some archival evidence for it as well. So I mean, that's not particularly ancient, but it is quite rare to be able to pin down specific dates to graffiti, because essentially much of that graffiti has been put there after the building's gone up. And if you know how old the building is, yes, but you've still got many centuries after that for the graffiti to have gone on. So dating it is actually very difficult. And the Knowle example was literally a once in the career opportunity to be able to date some. The oldest known burn marks, for example, have been assigned to about 1300 at Donnington Le Heath Manor House in Leicestershire. The oldest graffiti that I've looked at myself is probably going to be medieval, but again, pointing out the exact year or even decade is just really difficult to do. But in terms of other people's research, there's quite famous Viking age graffiti at the Hagia Sophia, which is probably one of the Varangian guards scrawling his name there. Of course, there's a lot of graffiti from that period in time. Maze Howe has some particularly filthy graffiti where somebody is recording the fact that he got laid in the chamber there, in the prehistoric chamber, again in the Viking period. And a lot of Roman graffiti is very scatological in nature as well. The gates, one of the gates at Pompeii has a particularly humorous commentary on the sexual activities of someone's mother, for example. We don't really get that sexualized graffiti in the medieval period, probably because the churches have got so many representations of naughty goings on in the carvings anyway. But then we might want to consider, well, what constitutes graffiti and how can we unpick graffiti from artwork? Because if we go back into the prehistoric period, where we've got Ice Age art at, say, Creswell Crags, the oldest known art in this country that's not portable anyway, or we go to the Pyrenean artworks as well, where we've actually got hand outlines in blown paint. It's difficult because at that point, it's difficult to try and address what's graffiti and what's art. And in fact, is graffiti sometimes art in and of itself? And I'll give you an example of this. There's a nice response to formal church artwork at the unnamed church outside the gates of Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire, where there's a phenomenal St. Christopher on the north wall of the nave. And St. Christopher's there with the Christ child in his arms, who's sort of got his hand in benediction, etc. And he's obviously crossing the water. And at his feet, the parishioners or the people who visited the church have actually inscribed ships. So they're floating along the river that St. Christopher's walking along. So sometimes you get this kind of graffiti, which is actually responsive to formal art in and of itself. So the lines are blurred. But in terms of the oldest stuff, all I can really say is medieval. The oldest stuff that I've personally recorded that I can assign a date to is going to be, the example from Hairsborough, really, which is later 15th into 16th century. Prior to that, I don't really have anything where I can pin down a precise date. It's difficult to do so. But we do have ideas with some graffiti that we are working in quite a dim, dark past.
That was a really wide-ranging answer, and it saves me asking. I'm going to name and shame because we're a high society here. I was asked by somebody, yes, you know who you are, Valerie, what is the rudest piece of graffiti? I think you've kind of answered that one. I'm going to paraphrase three questions that we've got into one because they're kind of the same question.
Yeah.
And basically the question is, some of this graffiti is really beautiful. It's very detailed. Clearly took a lot of time. How did the authorities feel about it?
So this question comes up literally every time I do this talk, and I feel really pleased and proud of my audiences when this question comes up, because it's a really fundamental one, because we are in this modern mindset of being in a situation where we're trying to have to unhook our own conceptions of this particular type of informal artwork, because we think of graffiti as being so naughty and transgressive and an eyesore. But I think it's pretty apparent that that wasn't the lived experience of the medieval period at all. And I think the reason we can be sure of that is because there isn't a single court case in the whole of the medieval period which is related to graffiti. Literally nobody's being pulled up in front of the church courts and given a dressing down. The earliest known court case that I know of for graffitiing in a church was identified by Anthea Horden in her research into the graffiti of gaming boards, and she actually found a court case from, I think, the 1690s, where two men are had up in the church courts for graffitiing a church building. I think it was either choir stalls or possibly a tomb. I can't quite remember that. I'd have to revisit Anthea's article on that subject. But yeah, so certainly until really the very end of the early modern period, it seems to be okay. And I think the reason that we can be fairly sure that it's okay is that I mentioned before that the response to the St. Christopher at Hales, but whenever we find medieval wall paintings, we are finding graffiti cut through it. Lots of examples of this from lots and lots of churches, but an example that springs to mind is the armorials, which are cut through some painted work right at the back end of Exeter Cathedral, where you can very clearly see a wall painted design, and then these armorials are chopped straight through it. And because so much of the church architecture was painted, we've sort of fetishized stone now, but we have to remember it was all plastered and painted. When one cuts through that graffiti, it would have been much more visible than it is now, because it acts as the canvas essentially, and then the stonework, which is a kind of a golden color, glows through. So it would have been much more visible than it is now. And I think that again gives us the idea that there was, if not the acknowledged license, there was a tacit license by the Catholic Church which allowed this. And of course, we've got good examples, for example, from Norwich, of the members of the clergy themselves enacting graffiti. There's a nice example as well from Knoll, where on the door jamb of one of the doors going between the bishop's private quarters, there's what really does look like the inscription Thomas Bortia, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury throughout most of the 15th century. It looks like he himself engaged in a bit of graffiti action. So it seems to be okay. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about that again.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to draw it to a close now. There are a number of comments in the box basically wanting to know more, and you've already directed people to your website, and so as this lecture is recorded, those details are up there if you've managed to jot them down. So I think that's been a fascinating lecture. It's been certainly one of the most engaging ones in terms of not only the detail and the presentation, but the questions we've been getting. Just to finally say thank you to James for a fascinating talk. We need to let him get off back to his research tonight.
Research? He's going down the pub as soon as this is done.
I have no knowledge of that information. And just to remind everyone that we will be back again next month, and we hope to see you all again then. So in the meantime, have a excellent Christmas and a peaceful New Year, and we shall see you in 2022.
Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting tonight, Hugh. Nice to see you again. Thanks to everyone for coming.
It's a pleasure.
Good night, all. Bye-bye.